So yeah, I was asked to share some high-level messages from my perspective as the Chief Executive of Victim Support Scotland, for those of you that have just joined, around the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on victims themselves and the impact on the justice system. And I think it's, what I really wanted to say was that this event, I think, is hugely important and really timely because of what's been happening over the last 10, 11 months. What we've seen as an organisation, and Victim Support Scotland provides emotional and practical support to victims and witnesses across the whole of Scotland for any crime type, is that we've seen some really quite acute, I guess, impacts from the coronavirus pandemic, which means that a trauma recovery focus, I think, is really, really, really important. What we've seen, first of all, is that people having reduced access to their normal support networks. So the kind of coping mechanisms, the people that they would normally go to for support, they haven't been able to access that in the way that they ordinarily would. And that has having a further impact on people's mental health. I think some of you may be aware of this already. I've said it publicly before, but right at the very beginning of the pandemic, we saw a 400% increase in the number of victims who were reporting suicidal thoughts at that time, and that trend has continued. It's fluctuated over time, but it is still a lot higher than we would normally expect to see. We've also seen, as well as reduced access to support networks, reduced access to some services, particularly psychological services, for victims who have and witnesses who have got existing mental health problems, and that really hasn't helped. And part of the other issue that we've seen more and more of, and this is continuing, is real financial impacts, where you've seen compounding effects of people being on furlough, people being made redundant, and some people experiencing really acute financial hardship as a result of being a victim of crime, and then on top of, you know, being unable to work in some cases, and family members being unable to work. That's having a really bad impact on a lot of people. We, to respond to that, increased our victims fund quite considerably in anticipation of this. We've been spending that victims fund money at a rate of knots, really, to try and catch up with demand. Can I just double check that everybody puts themselves on mute, please? Thank you. We also are aware that some victims are at higher risk during the pandemic and the associated lockdowns, etc. Along with that, you'll be well aware of that yourselves, I'm sure. Victims of domestic abuse, in particular, those that are living at home with their abuser, are at higher risk. We've seen that stalking, in particular cyber stalking, because online activity has increased quite considerably over the pandemic. And there are deep concerns about children and young people in some cases who are living in abusive or neglectful environments. And with schools closing, obviously, at times that has had a further impact on them themselves. I think it's also worth saying, and it'll get touched on in some of the presentations that are coming up later, that the system itself can cause trauma and can further impact victims and witnesses. The way that the criminal justice system is set up, we often hear from victims and witnesses, and it's difficult sometimes for organisations that are within the criminal justice system to hear this, but we often hear, for example, that people's experience of going to court was more traumatic than the event that happened to them themselves and the reason that they were in court in the first place. So for us, this event is really, really crucially important. The way that we treat people, the way that they are, you know, we treat them with dignity and respect through the whole of the criminal justice system is absolutely important and has to be given some attention. We also ask people to retell their story, and in some cases this means reliving what has happened to them, and that too can cause trauma itself. And what we are concerned about through the coronavirus pandemic is that what we're starting to see with the massive delays that there are in terms of court cases and the like, we are starting to see what's called witness attrition. So this is witnesses just no engaging in the system. And we are also starting to hear quite a lot of despondency from victims to say, well, what is the point of reporting something because nothing's ever going to happen about it as well, which is obviously of huge concern to all of us. So without further ado, I think we're going to move on to the next presentation.